The sound that ended Galatea Albright's marriage wasn't a gunshot or a scream. It was a soft, feminine laugh, tinkling like ice in a crystal glass, coming from a place it should never have been. She was 7 months pregnant, sitting in the half-finished nursery of their Park Avenue penthouse, testing the new state-of-the-art baby monitor she'd bought as a surprise for her husband. But the feed she accidentally connected to wasn't the nursery. It was the live security camera from her husband's private jet, the Gulfstream G700 she'd helped him design the interior for, and on the cream leather couch under the soft ambient lighting she had personally chosen, billionaire Conrad Brinsley was entertaining a guest whose laughter was the prelude to an act of betrayal so profound it would not only shatter a marriage, but dismantle an entire empire. Galatea Albright had always known she was an anomaly in the world of the Brinsleys. She was the daughter of a history professor and a librarian, a woman who found more beauty in the clean lines of a blueprint than in the blinding sparkle of a diamond necklace. She'd met Conrad Brinsley at a charity gala she'd attended as a junior architect for the firm designing the new museum wing. He had been captivated by her quiet intelligence and the passion in her eyes when she spoke about structural integrity and sustainable design. He was the golden heir to Brinsley Holdings, a global real estate and investment empire built by his ruthless father, William Brinsley. Conrad was handsome, charming, and possessed an easy confidence that came from a life utterly devoid of want or consequence. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of helicopter dates to the Hamptons' private viewings at Sotheby's and dinners in Paris. His family, particularly his mother Camille, had been politely horrified. In their eyes, Galatea was a commoner, a pretty but ultimately unsuitable accessory for their prized heir. They saw her master's degree from MIT not as an achievement, but as a quaint little hobby. The prenuptial agreement they'd pushed on her was thicker than a phone book, a document designed to remind her with every clause that she was a guest in their world, not a stakeholder. She signed it without argument, believing Conrad's love was the only asset she needed. For 5 years she played the part. She hosted flawless dinner parties, chaired the right charities, and learned to smile through the thinly veiled condescension of Camille and her circle of society swans. She loved Conrad, or at least the man he was when they were alone, away from the crushing weight of his legacy. She became his quiet confidant, the one person he could show a sliver of vulnerability to. He was obsessed with stepping out of his father's shadow, and his magnum opus was to be the Helios Project, a colossal, multi-billion-dollar mixed-use development on the west side of Manhattan. It was to be his legacy, a glittering testament to his vision. Galatea, with her trained eye, had tried to be a part of it. One evening months ago, he'd been looking over geological surveys for the Helios site. "The bedrock composition here is unusual," she'd remarked, peering over his shoulder. "This much schist and marble interlayering, especially with the proximity to the river. Have you run the deep soil stability models? The load-bearing calculations for the central tower might be optimistic." Conrad had patted her hand dismissively, a gesture he probably thought was affectionate. "Galatea, darling, don't worry your pretty head about it. We have the best engineers in the world. They said it's a non-issue, just requires a slightly deeper foundation pour. It's handled." She saw the report he was looking at from a firm called Geotechnical Solutions. She saw the section they'd flagged as a minor cautionary finding. Minor was not a word architects like to hear in conjunction with geology, but she let it go. He didn't want a partner. He wanted a beautiful, supportive wife, and so she had focused her creative energies on their life, on their soon-to-be-born son, and on creating a perfect home, which brought her to this moment. Friday, August 15th, Conrad was supposedly on a quick business trip to Chicago, a one-day affair to close a deal, He was due back late tonight. As a surprise, Galatea had the new nursery security system installed early. It was top of the line, capable of syncing with all their other household and personal devices through a central hub. While configuring the app on her tablet, she saw a list of available feeds: nursery, living room, penthouse entrance, and one she didn't recognize labeled simply G700 cabin. Curious thinking it was a system glitch, she tapped it. The image that filled her screen was crystal clear. It was the interior of their jet, unmistakable. Conrad was there, his tie loosened, a glass of whiskey in hand. He wasn't alone. Across from him, curled into the plush leather, was a woman Galatea recognized instantly, Katerina Volkov, a Russian heiress whose family was as notorious as they were wealthy. She was a fixture in the society pages, known for her sharp beauty and even sharper ambition. She and Conrad were from the same tribe, the one Galatea could only ever visit. Galatea felt a cold stone drop in her stomach. Maybe it was a business meeting. A very, very casual one. She muted the sound from the television playing in the background, her hand trembling as she increased the volume on the tablet. William is being impossible about the budget for the Spire. Conrad was saying, his voice a low grumble. He doesn't understand that aesthetics are everything. The Helios project has to be a monument. Katerina laughed, the very sound that would become the soundtrack to the end of Galatea's world. Darling, your father only understands leverage and power. Just show him the numbers from the foreign pre-sales. He'll fold. She reached out her long, lacquered nails, tracing the line of his jaw. Besides, you have more persuasive talents. Conrad leaned in, capturing her hand and kissing her palm. Is that so? You convinced me, didn't you? Katerina purred, her voice dropping to an intimate whisper. And after all that talk about your delicate, pregnant little wife at home. The words hit Galatea like a physical blow. She couldn't breathe. Delicate, pregnant little wife. The description was so dismissive, so utterly contemptuous. It was how his mother spoke of her. It was how they all saw her. A fragile incubator for the next Brinsley heir. She watched, frozen in a rictus of horror, as Conrad leaned forward and kissed Katerina. It wasn't a fleeting peck. It was a long, slow, hungry kiss filled with a familiarity that spoke of months, not moments. He was not on his way to Chicago. The tablet's location data for the G700 feed showed it sitting on a private tarmac in Teterboro, New Jersey, having never left. The lie was as brazen as the infidelity. The world tilted. The soft grey paint of the nursery walls seemed to close in on her. The tiny assembled crib in the corner, a symbol of her most profound joy, now looked like a cage. Every shared laugh, every tender touch, every promise Conrad had ever made replayed in her mind, now tainted and grotesque. He hadn't just cheated. He had mocked her condition and the life they were supposed to be building. He had reduced her to an obstacle, a delicate thing to be managed while he lived his real life. The shock lasted for exactly 90 seconds. Then something inside her, something forged in the competitive fires of architecture school and hardened by 5 years of Brinsley condescension, snapped into place. The grief was there, a howling vortex in her chest, but it was immediately encased in a sheath of ice-cold, crystalline rage. She didn't cry, she did not scream. Her mind, trained to see stress points and structural flaws, saw her entire life as a faulty building that needed to be demolished. She stood up her hand, protectively on her swollen belly. This was no longer just about her. It was about the child she was carrying, a child who would not be raised in a world of lies and disrespect. She looked at the tablet, at the man she thought she knew, and felt a strange and terrifying clarity. He saw her as delicate. He was about to find out just how wrong he was. The house of Brinsley had a fatal flaw, and she was going to be the one to bring it down. Galatea moved with the preternatural calm of a surgeon before a critical operation. The hurricane of emotion was contained, channeled into pure, methodical action. She walked out of the nursery, closing the door softly behind her, as if to shield the room from the contamination of what was to come. She went into their master bedroom, a vast space of muted tones and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. It was a beautiful prison, and she was about to stage the most audacious escape in its history. She didn't pack a suitcase. That was what fleeing victims did. She was not a victim. She was an executioner. Instead, she walked to her private safe, hidden behind a minimalist painting. She entered the code and retrieved her personal documents, her passport, her original birth certificate, and a hard drive. This drive was her secret ledger, containing copies of every document she had ever signed related to the Brinsleys, including the infamous prenup, along with her own financial records and architectural portfolios, a life separate from the one they had curated for her. Next, she made 2 phone calls. The first was to Lena Petrova, her best friend from college. Lena was a fiercely loyal, brilliantly pragmatic journalist who had always viewed the Brinsleys with a healthy dose of suspicion. Lena Galatea said, her voice even and steady, betraying none of the chaos inside. "I need a favor. A big one." "Galatea, what's wrong? You sound strange." "I'm leaving Conrad. I need a place to disappear for a while. No questions, just a key and an address nobody knows." There was a stunned silence then. "My brother's old apartment, Tribeca. He's in Singapore for 6 months. It's empty. I'll meet you there in an hour. Galatea, are you okay?" "I will be." Galatea said, the certainty in her own voice surprising her. "I'll text you when I'm on my way." The second call was to a number she had been given by her father years ago for a rainy day. It was the direct line for Miss Harriet Shaw, a legendary divorce attorney known in New York, legal circles as the Shark in Chanel. She was notorious for dismantling the fortunes of arrogant husbands. "Harriet Shaw." The voice was brisk, no nonsense. "Miss Shaw, my name is Galatea Albright. My father, Professor Robert Albright, said I should call you if I ever needed the best. I need the best." There was a brief pause. "I remember your father, a brilliant man. I assume this is about Mr. Brinsley." "It is. I have irrefutable evidence of infidelity and financial deception. I will be vacating my marital home within the hour. I need to know what my first moves should be. Don't take anything that could be construed as a joint asset. Take only your personal effects documents and any gifts given to you before the marriage. Turn off the location tracking on your phone. Do not speak to your husband or any member of his family. Refer them all to me. I'll have a retainer agreement messengered to you wherever you are going. We'll meet Monday morning. Mrs. Albright. Hold on tight." "Thank you," Galatea said, and hung up. With her preparations made, she sat on the edge of her perfectly made bed and picked up her phone. She navigated to Conrad's contact number. Her thumb hovered over the call button. This was it. The point of no return. She took one deep, steadying breath, placed her hand on her belly, and pressed the button. It rang twice. "Galatea, hey, honey." Conrad's voice was smooth, casual, the voice of a man with nothing to hide. "I was just thinking about you. Bad turbulence over Ohio, can you believe it?" The lie was so effortless, it was almost impressive. Galatea's voice was devoid of all warmth, as flat and cold as a sheet of glass. "Where are you, Conrad?" He hesitated for a fraction of a second. "I just told you, sweetheart. Over Ohio, on my way to Chicago. Why is everything okay?" I'm looking at a live feed from the G700 Conrad. She said each word, a perfectly polished stone dropped into a silent pool. It's parked at Teterboro, and you are not alone. Say hello to Katerina for me. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It stretched for 5, then 10 seconds. Galatea could picture him perfectly, the blood draining from his face, the charming facade cracking to reveal the panicked mediocrity beneath. She heard a muffled sound, his hand covering the receiver, and a sharp, feminine gasp. Katerina. Galatea, listen to me. He finally stammered, his voice tight with panic. It's not what it looks like. It's a misunderstanding. Katerina and I were we were discussing a business deal. A business deal. Galatea repeated, her voice dripping with scorn. Is that what you call it when your tongue is halfway down her throat? Was it business when you referred to me as your delicate, pregnant little wife? Another choked silence. He was caught, utterly and completely. Baby, please, he pleaded, the arrogance replaced by a desperate wheedling tone she found repulsive. Let me come home. We can talk about this. We can fix this. Don't do anything rash. Think about the baby. Oh, I am, she said, and for the first time, a sliver of her monumental fury broke through the ice. I am thinking of nothing but this baby, which is why this is the last conversation you and I will ever have without lawyers present. What, Galatea, don't be ridiculous. He snapped, his fear now turning to anger. You can't be serious. Our life, our family. We don't have a family, she cut him off. We have a business arrangement that has just been terminated. You have breached every contract, spoken and unspoken. Consider this your official notice. You can't divorce me. He almost laughed, a hysterical, unbelieving sound. Galatea, have you forgotten the prenup you'll walk away with next to nothing? You'll be ruined. It was his final fatal mistake. The threat. The assumption that money was the only thing that mattered, the only weapon in his arsenal. Galatea actually smiled, a cold, grim curve of her lips. Conrad, she said, her voice now dropping to a near whisper, a tone of finality that chilled him to the bone. You built our life on a foundation of lies. I, on the other hand, am an architect. I know a thing or two about foundations. And I know that yours is fatally flawed. You're about to find out what it's like when everything you've built comes crashing down around you. Have your lawyer call Harriet Shaw. She hung up. She didn't block his number. She simply silenced it. Within seconds it began to vibrate incessantly. Conrad calling, then a text, then another, then a call from Camille Brinsley, then his father William. She ignored them all, slipping the phone into her purse. She stood up and took one last look around the opulent bedroom. It was no longer her home. It was a museum of a dead marriage. With a final deep breath, she walked out, leaving her keys on the marble console in the foyer. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, the sound echoing like a gavel falling on the end of an era. Galatea Albright, the billionaire's wife, was gone. In her place, a woman armed with a terrible knowledge and an unbreakable will was walking out into the New York City night, ready to go to war. The first 48 hours were a blur of adrenaline and logistics. Lena was a rock, a whirlwind of quiet efficiency, who stocked the Tribeca apartment with food, prenatal vitamins, and burner phones, creating a sanctuary where Galatea could think. The media, sniffing a story, had already started camping outside the Park Avenue penthouse. Conrad, true to form, had released a statement through a publicist about his beloved wife taking a brief private rest before the birth of their child. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. On Monday morning, Galatea, dressed in simple black trousers and a silk blouse that didn't betray her wealth or her pregnancy, walked into the offices of Shaw and Associates. The firm occupied a sleek, minimalist space in the Seagram building, exuding an aura of expensive lethal competence. Harriet Shaw was exactly as her reputation suggested. In her late 50s, with sharp grey eyes and a presence that could curdle milk, she commanded the room from behind a vast mahogany desk. She listened without interruption as Galatea laid out the story, her narrative precise and unemotional. She presented a thumb drive containing the screen-recorded video from the jet's security feed. "The video is damning," Harriet said, her expression unreadable. "It's a clear violation of the infidelity clause. However, the Brinsleys will fight it. They will say it was a momentary lapse, and they will try to bury us in litigation until you are exhausted and broke." "The prenup is ironclad," she continued, pulling up a copy of the document on a large screen. "It essentially caps your settlement at a one-time payment of $5 million plus child support determined by the court. They'll give you that just to make you go away quietly." "I don't want to go away quietly," Galatea stated, her voice firm. "And I don't care about the $5 million. It's an insult." Harriet raised an eyebrow. "Then what do you want, Mrs. Albright?" "I want to ruin him." Galatea said the words, stark and brutal, in the quiet office. "Not emotionally, financially. I want to dismantle the project that matters more to him than his wife or his child. I want to take down the Helios project." For the first time, Harriet Shaw looked genuinely intrigued. She leaned forward, her sharp eyes boring into Galatea. "That's a bold ambition. Brinsley Holdings is a titan. How do you propose to do that?" This was the moment. Galatea opened her briefcase and took out a thick binder. For the past 2 days, while the world thought she was weeping into her pillows, she had been working. She had retrieved her old academic logins, accessed geological databases, cross-referenced city planning archives, and used her knowledge of architectural software to run preliminary models. Conrad and his father see the Helios site as a gold mine. I see it as a catastrophe waiting to happen. She began. She opened the binder to the geotechnical solutions report Conrad had dismissed. They flagged this section on schist and marble interlayering as a minor issue. It's not. The specific type of schist on that site, the Manhattan schist, is notoriously unpredictable when subjected to the kind of deep earth drilling and immense concentrated pressure a super-tall skyscraper requires, especially when it's adjacent to a fault line, however minor and saturated by groundwater from the Hudson. She flipped through pages of charts, seismic data, and historical soil analysis. Their solution was a deeper foundation pour. That's like putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. It doesn't address the core problem potential for subsurface shearing. Under the immense weight of the central tower, especially during periods of heavy rainfall or minor seismic activity, the marble layers could effectively liquefy, causing the schist above to shift. The models I've run, even with limited data, show a potential for catastrophic foundational failure over a 20 to 30-year timeline. The building won't just lean, it could shear its own pilings. Harriet was silent, her gaze fixed on the data. She was a lawyer, not an engineer, but she understood risk. "This is compelling," Harriet admitted, "but it's your analysis against a team of engineers from a top firm. A firm that Brinsley Holdings has on a multi-million-dollar retainer," Galatea countered. "They have a vested interest in telling their client what he wants to hear. Conrad is rushing this. He's cutting corners to stay on an aggressive timeline and impress his father. He's arrogant enough to believe that money can bend the laws of physics." "So you leak this to the press?" Harriet asked. "No," Galatea said immediately. "They'd paint me as a scorned wife throwing baseless accusations. They'd bury my report under a mountain of their own paid experts. I can't fight him in the press. I have to fight him in the market. She took a deep breath. There is one person who hates William Brinsley more than anyone else in this city, Donovan Pierce. Donovan Pierce was old money, a ruthless, legendary investor who had been William Brinsley's primary rival for 4 decades. Their feud was the stuff of Wall Street law. Pierce is a predator, Harriet warned. He'll eat you alive. He might, Galatea agreed. But he's also a pragmatist, and I'm about to hand him the knife that can finally gut his biggest enemy. I don't want to just expose the flaw in the Helios project. I want to build its replacement. She pulled out a second, smaller binder. It contained a preliminary proposal, complete with sketches and financial projections. The land directly adjacent to the Helios site is an old, derelict shipping depot. It's been tied up in zoning disputes for years. If someone with enough leverage could clear the red tape, it's a prime location. But instead of one massive high-risk tower, you build a smarter, more sustainable multi-use development. A green campus with residential, commercial, and public spaces that integrates with the city instead of dominating it. It would be safer, more profitable in the long run, and could be built faster. If we announce this project backed by someone like Pierce, and quietly short Brinsley Holdings' stock using the geological data as our justification, the market will get nervous. Investors will start asking questions. Independent analysts will run their own geologicals. The truth will come out not from me, but from them. By the time the Helios Foundation shows its first stress fracture, we'll already own the future of the West Side. Harriet Shaw leaned back in her chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. She looked at the pregnant woman sitting across from her, a woman who had weaponized her intellect, her pain, and her intimate knowledge of her enemy's hubris. She wasn't just a scorned wife. She was a queen planning a coup. Mrs. Albright, Harriet said, her voice filled with a newfound respect. Let me make a call. I believe Mr. Pierce will be very interested in meeting the architect of his rival's demise. The meeting with Donovan Pierce took place in the hushed cathedral-like silence of the New York Public Library's private Astor reading room. The air smelled of old paper and lemon polish. Pierce, a man who seemed carved from granite, and impatience did not offer pleasantries. He sat opposite Galatea at a long, dark wood table, his sharp eyes dissecting her, searching for the slightest hint of emotional instability or feminine hysteria weaknesses he could not afford. For a full, uninterrupted hour he listened. Galatea laid out her case, not as a plea, but as an ironclad business proposition. She presented the geological data, her advanced structural stress models, and the fatal hubris of the Brinsleys, which she framed as a predictable market vulnerability. She never once mentioned her broken heart or Conrad's betrayal. She spoke of risk analysis, market opportunity, and return on investment. When she finished, he was silent for what felt like an eternity, his gaze unwavering. This is an extraordinary claim. Ms. Albright, he rumbled, his voice low and gravelly. You're asking me to wage a multi-billion-dollar war against William Brinsley based on your architectural intuition and his son's romantic indiscretions. No, Mr. Pierce, Galatea corrected him, her voice steady and cool. I'm asking you to trust in physics greed and a lifetime of observing your rival's fatal flaw, his ego. William Brinsley cannot and will not ever admit he is wrong. When challenged, he will not retreat and re-evaluate. He will double down, and that is where we will break him. She pushed a second, slimmer binder across the table. This is the Argent Project, a smarter, safer, more profitable alternative. This isn't just about destroying Helios. It's about building its replacement before it even has a chance to fail. He opened the binder, his eyes scanning the elegant renderings and the ruthlessly efficient financial projections. He saw it all, the genius of the design, the precision of the strategy, and the sheer audacious scope of her ambition. He saw the knife she was offering him, perfectly shaped to fit between William Brinsley's ribs. A slow, predatory smile, the first sign of warmth she had seen from him, spread across his face. "And your price for this remarkable opportunity?" he asked, already knowing he would pay it. "I don't want your money, Mr. Pierce. I want a seat at the table," she declared. 10% equity, full architectural and operational control as CEO. I'm not just giving you the weapon. I'm going to be the one to wield it." He looked at her, then truly looked at her, and saw not a scorned wife, but a queen leading a coup. He extended a large weathered hand across the table. "Mrs. Albright," he said, the smile turning into a grin, "welcome to the game." The weeks that followed were a blur of controlled chaos. Ethelred Developments was born its name, a subtle nod to an old English king, Ethelred the Unready, who was perpetually underestimated by his enemies to their ultimate peril. Galatea, now 7 months pregnant, moved with the ferocious energy of a woman with a finite amount of time. She assembled a lean, brilliant team of industry outsiders and hungry young talents who were drawn to her vision and the chance to take on a titan. Pierce's machine worked in the background, clearing political and financial hurdles with breathtaking speed. The derelict shipping depot was acquired, permits were fast-tracked, and a formidable war chest was amassed. Ethelred Developments announced the Argent project at a sleek, heavily publicized press event. The architectural world was stunned by the elegance and innovation of the design. The financial world was electrified by the bold, direct challenge to Brinsley Holdings, backed by the legendary Donovan Pierce. The Brinsley's public reaction was a performance of theatrical disdain. William Brinsley told a reporter it was a desperate and rather pathetic move by a disgruntled party. Conrad, in an interview with the Wall Street Journal, delivered the line that would come to haunt him. "The Argent project is a quaint, uninspired sideshow. My wife, my ex-wife, is a talented woman, but she is an architect, not a developer. This is a sad, desperate attempt to remain relevant." His condescension was a gift. He had publicly underestimated her, framing the battle as one between an emotional woman and a powerful man. It was a narrative Galatea would methodically dismantle brick by brick. The war was fought on 2 fronts. The first was the earth and steel of the west side. Galatea was a constant presence at the Argent site, her pregnant belly prominent beneath her hard hat. She commanded the respect of the construction crews and engineers because she knew their language understood the load-bearing capacity of a steel beam and could read a complex schematic as easily as a novel. Her site was a model of order and cutting-edge technology. Drones monitored progress, safety records were impeccable, and morale was high. It stood in stark, silent judgment of the Helios site next door, from which rumors of chaos cut corners and rising tensions had already begun to leak. The second front was the sterile, airless conference room of the depositions. Conrad's legal team, led by the smug Robert Geller, tried to break her. They subjected her to grueling 10-hour sessions, probing into the most intimate details of her marriage, trying to paint her as a manipulative gold digger. Conrad was forced to sit there through it, all his face a mask of simmering fury. During one particularly brutal session, Geller leaned forward. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Albright, that your entire company, this entire Argent project, is nothing more than an elaborate and vindictive scheme to damage the man who was so generous to you for so many years?" The room was silent. Harriet Shaw subtly shook her head, warning Galatea not to take the bait. But Galatea didn't look at Harriet. She looked directly at Conrad, her gaze clear and unwavering. "Mr. Geller," she said, her voice calm and devoid of malice, My husband's generosity was a gilded cage. I am not in the business of spite. I am in the business of building things that last. A flicker of something shock, maybe even shame, crossed Conrad's face before it was buried under a wave of anger. She had not only answered the question, she had delivered her verdict on him, on his project, on his entire legacy. 2 weeks before her due date, after a marathon session, finalizing the second-stage financing for Argent, Galatea went into labor. She gave birth to a healthy 7-pound baby boy. In the quiet of the private hospital room, she held him in her arms and named him Nicholas. Looking at his tiny, perfect face, she felt the last vestiges of vengeful fury melt away, replaced by a love so fierce and protective, it redefined her entire mission. This was no longer about tearing Conrad down. This was about building a better, safer, more honest world for her son. A bouquet of impossibly expensive white orchids arrived from Conrad with a note requesting a visit. She had the flowers sent to the nurse's station and had her assistant inform his lawyer that any visitation requests would have to be submitted through the proper court channels. The rules of the Brinsleys no longer applied. As she prepared to leave the hospital with Nicholas, her world now centered on this small, warm bundle in her arms, her phone buzzed with the news alert that would signal the beginning of the end. The independent insurance report had been released. The first undeniable crack had appeared in the foundation of the House of Brinsley, and Galatea, holding her son, knew she had already built her own on solid rock. The first domino fell not with a crash, but with the quiet, authoritative weight of a published report. Galatea was in a weekly planning meeting, reviewing thermal imaging data from the Argent project's curtain wall installation, when a discreet notification lit up her tablet. It was a lead story from the Wall Street Journal, Helios Project Insurability, questioned after damning geological survey. Her breath hitched. She calmly excused herself, stepped into her private office, and read the article, her heart beating a steady, heavy rhythm against her ribs. It was all there. A small independent firm, hired by a nervous consortium of insurance underwriters, had refused to sign off. The report cited significant and alarming subsurface instability and a high probability of long-term foundational shearing. They demanded a complete halt to construction and a foundational redesign that would take at minimum a year and cost hundreds of millions. A cold, clean wave of vindication washed over her. It wasn't triumph or glee. It was the quiet, profound satisfaction of a mathematician seeing a complex proof finally resolve. She had been right. Physics and geology, the immutable laws Conrad believed he could bend with money, had rendered their verdict. The Brinsleys' response was swift and apoplectic. William, his face a mask of puce rage, held a televised press conference. He stood at a podium flanked by a grim-faced Conrad and decried the report as a cowardly act of corporate sabotage orchestrated by our rivals. He called the surveyors hired guns and announced with a defiant roar that Brinsley Holdings was so confident in the project that he was not only accelerating the construction timeline, but was also personally guaranteeing the initial bonds. "The vultures are circling," he spat into the microphones, "but the House of Brinsley is not so easily brought down." Watching the broadcast from her office, Galatea felt a chill. She saw the desperation behind the bravado. He was doubling down on a losing hand, fueled by pure ego. Beside him, Conrad looked pale and strained his eyes, darting nervously. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by the haunted look of a man beginning to understand that the ship was sinking. While they were shouting at the world, Galatea sent a single calm directive to her own project manager. "Maintain all safety protocols. No rush. We build it right, or we don't build it at all." The contrast between the two sites became a running story in the city's media. The Helios site was a frantic, chaotic hive of activity, running 3 shifts a day. News reports began to surface about union complaints and safety violations. Meanwhile, the Argent project site was a model of calm efficiency. Drones zipped through the air, monitoring progress. Robotic welders worked with tireless precision, and every stage was meticulously documented and signed off. Galatea's company was celebrated for its transparency and innovation. The Forbes feature, The Architect of Change. How Galatea Albright is remaking the Manhattan skyline and rewriting the rules. Solidified her new public identity. She deftly sidestepped questions about her divorce, redirecting every interview back to the principles of sustainable design and ethical business. She was no longer just a wronged wife. She was a visionary, and she was winning. Behind the scenes, the legal battle for the divorce raged on a war of 1,000 paper cuts. Conrad's lawyers grew more vicious filing motions, accusing her of corporate espionage and of being an unfit mother due to her demanding work schedule. Harriet Shaw met every attack with a surgeon's precision, dismantling their claims with cold, hard evidence of Galatea's meticulous planning and devotion to Nicholas. During the final discovery phase, Harriet called Galatea for an urgent meeting. On her desk, she laid out a series of bank statements and encrypted emails. "We found it," Harriet said, her voice grimly satisfied. The files proved beyond any doubt that Conrad had used a shell company funded by marital assets to pay a $2 million bribe to a city planning official, ensuring an early zoning variance for the Helios site was approved without a full environmental impact review. It was a criminal act. "We could send him to prison with this," Harriet stated. Galatea looked at the evidence of his corruption, the sheer arrogant carelessness of it all. For a moment, she felt the temptation for that kind of absolute destructive revenge. But she shook her head. "No," she said, "not yet. We hold it. Let his own arrogance be the cause of his downfall. We'll only use this if we absolutely have to." It was her trump card, a loaded gun held in reserve, and its silent, unseen pressure was more powerful than a public accusation. The end came on a rainy Tuesday in late spring, the sky the color of wet concrete. Under immense pressure from his father, Conrad had ordered the main foundation pour for the central tower to proceed, despite the torrential rain, a reckless move that saturated the already unstable ground. Just after 3 p.m., a section of the massive excavation wall, unable to bear the pressure of the rain-soaked earth and the vibrations from the convoy of cement trucks, gave way. With a horrifying groan of shearing metal and collapsing soil, 1,000 tons of mud and shoring material slumped into the construction pit. It wasn't the cataclysmic failure of the tower itself, but it was the material proof of the site's instability. A few workers were injured, but miraculously no one was killed. The effect, however, was lethal. City inspectors swarmed the site, issuing an immediate and indefinite stop work order. OSHA launched a federal investigation. The news footage of the partial collapse of ambulances and frantic workers played on a loop on every news channel. It was the physical manifestation of every warning. For the market, it was the final fatal signal. The stock, already teetering, went into absolute freefall. A major European investment bank, spooked by the disaster and the now uninsurable nature of the project, called in its 9-figure loan. It was a margin call Brinsley Holdings over-leveraged and hemorrhaging cash could not meet. The panicked sell-off began. In a single brutal afternoon of trading, 40% of the Brinsley empire's value vanished. Billions of dollars, decades of legacy, evaporated into the ether. From across the city, Donovan Pierce's traders watched the bloodbath and began to close their massive short positions, executing one of the most profitable trades in the firm's history. The collapse of Helios created a vacuum in the West Side development landscape, a vacuum the Argent project, now seen as the only viable safe and prestigious investment, was perfectly positioned to fill. Its own valuation didn't just rise, it exploded. Galatea wasn't watching the stock ticker. She was in the nursery she had once sat in while her world fell apart. The room was now filled with warmth and life. She was rocking Nicholas, humming a soft lullaby, when her personal phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text from Harriet Shaw. "Check the news. It's over." A few days later, a courier delivered a final package from Harriet's office. Inside were 2 envelopes. The first was thin. It contained the divorce settlement check for $5 million, the exact amount stipulated in the prenup Conrad had once wielded as a threat. It felt flimsy, almost weightless in her hand. The second envelope was thick and heavy. It contained the certified third-quarter valuation of Ethelred Developments and a statement of her 10% equity stake. Following the collapse of Helios, her share was now conservatively valued at $1.2 billion. She stared at the 2 documents, side by side. One was the price of her silence, an insult disguised as a settlement. The other was the fruit of her voice, her vision, her relentless work. She picked up a pen, endorsed the back of the $5 million check, and slipped it into a new envelope. The next morning, she had it messengered with no return address to a non-profit foundation that provided pro bono legal services to women and children leaving abusive homes. It was the last piece of Brinsley money she would ever touch. Her wealth was not theirs to give. Her fortune was her own, built from the ashes of their lies. A year clicked past each day, laying another layer of solid ground over the fault line that had once split Galatea's life in 2. The Argent project, once a blueprint born of fury, was now a celebrated reality of glass and green steel, a rising testament to sustainable design on the Manhattan skyline. It was lauded in architectural journals and studied in universities. Galatea Albright's new life settled into a rhythm that was both demanding and deeply peaceful. Her days were a carefully conducted symphony of contrasts, high-stakes negotiations with investors in the morning, followed by afternoons spent on the floor of her spacious, sunlit apartment, patiently guiding Nicholas's chubby fingers as he tried to stack wooden blocks. She was CEO, architect, and mother, and she wore each hat with a quiet, earned confidence. The news of the Brinsleys' continued decline reached her not as a triumphant roar, but as a distant, fading echo. She'd see headlines on her newsfeed while waiting for a coffee. Brinsley Holdings sells off flagship hotel portfolio to cover debts, and would feel a flicker of something, not joy, but a kind of clinical detachment, like reading a case study from a history book. William Brinsley, the patriarch who had once looked at her as if she were dirt on his shoe, had been unceremoniously ousted from his own board and had retreated into a bitter, self-imposed exile in his Hamptons estate. Conrad, she heard through the legal grapevine, was trapped in a purgatory of civil litigation from furious Helios project investors. The district attorney's office was slowly, methodically building a criminal case around the bribery charges. The golden heir was now a pariah, his name a cautionary tale whispered at the galas he could no longer attend. His easy charm had curdled into a permanent scowl, seen only in paparazzi photos of him leaving his lawyer's office. Their former Park Avenue penthouse, a place she once thought of as the pinnacle of her life, had been sold at a loss to a tech billionaire. Galatea felt no satisfaction in this, only a profound sense of finality. Their world and the man who ruled it had simply ceased to be relevant. She saw him one last time on a grey Tuesday in November. A sudden cold rain had begun to fall, and she ducked into a small, unassuming cafe in the West Village to escape the downpour, her mind preoccupied with a structural equation for a new project. The cafe was warm and smelled of roasted coffee beans and wet coats, and there he was, sitting alone in a corner booth, staring into a ceramic mug with both hands wrapped around it as if for warmth. For a disorienting second, she didn't recognize him. He was just a man hollowed out and weary, swimming in a suit that was well made, but hung on him now a size too big for his diminished presence. Then his eyes lifted, scanning the room with a dull listlessness, and they met hers. The jolt of recognition was instantaneous, a cold spark, but the panic and fear that his face once inspired were gone. All she saw was the ruin. The arrogant glint in his eyes had been replaced by a haunted, exhausted bitterness. He looked at her, and his face cycled through a decade of emotions. In a few seconds, a flash of his old, reflexive anger, followed by the deep, crushing weight of regret. And finally, a look of raw, bewildered awe. He was looking at her, not as the wife he had betrayed, but as the force of nature that had dismantled his universe. Galatea stood frozen for a moment, the bell above the door tinkling softly as another customer entered. She could have turned and walked out. She could have approached him. She could have said any of the 1,000 cutting things she had once rehearsed in the dead of night. Instead, she felt a strange and absolute calm settle over her. The anger that had fueled her, the pain that had nearly broken her, it was all gone. In its place was not a void, but a profound and immovable peace. The man in the booth was not her great enemy. He was simply a stranger, a ghost from a life that no longer belonged to her. She gave him a slow, almost imperceptible nod, not of forgiveness, but of acknowledgement. A final closing of a chapter. Then she turned her back on him, walked to the counter, and ordered her latte. She didn't look back as she waited, didn't check to see if he was still watching. When her coffee was ready, she paid and walked back out into the rain, the bell on the door marking her exit as quietly as it had marked her entrance. He had not warranted a change in her day, not even for a minute. Her victory, she realized as she walked the bustling city street, was never about his ruin. It was about her own creation. It wasn't about the billions she had made, but about the value she had built. Conrad and his father had built an empire on a flawed foundation of arrogance and deceit, and it had crumbled under its own weight. She had taken the rubble of her life and used it as the foundation for something strong, honest, and enduring. That evening, she stood with Nicholas on the observation deck of the newly opened Argent Tower. The rain had passed, and the city glittered below them, a galaxy of infinite lights. Nicholas, his small hand wrapped securely in hers, pointed a chubby finger at the sprawling metropolis. Looking out at that breathtaking view, a view she had earned with her mind and her will, Galatea understood the truth of her journey. She hadn't just escaped the gilded cage. She had redesigned the world around it, crafting a new skyline on her own terms. The best revenge she knew now wasn't just living well. It was building a legacy so magnificent that the man who wronged you becomes nothing more than a forgotten footnote in your own incredible story. Galatea's story isn't just about revenge against a cheating husband. It's a powerful testament to the strength that lies within us when we are most broken. It's a story about recognizing that your true value is not determined by who you marry or the name you carry, but by your own intellect, your own integrity, and your own will to build. She transformed her deepest pain into her greatest power, proving that a woman underestimated is the most formidable force in the world. She didn't just get rich. She got even by becoming everything they said she couldn't be: a leader, a visionary, and the architect of her own destiny. If her journey from a betrayed wife to a self-made titan inspired you, please hit that like button to show your support. What part of her story resonated with you the most? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength. For more incredible stories of resilience and empowerment, make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications. You won't want to miss what's coming next. A single glass of champagne. That's all it took to shatter a perfect life. For Olivia Bennet, it was supposed to be a night of celebration, a moment to finally share the secret she held close, the new life growing inside her. But her husband, Nicholas Valmont, had a secret of his own. In the glittering ballroom of New York's most exclusive charity gala, surrounded by their closest friends and the city's elite, he wouldn't just break her heart. He would try to obliterate her soul. He paraded his betrayal in a designer dress, thinking his pregnant wife was nothing more than a footnote in his grand story. But he forgot one crucial detail: a billion-dollar secret buried in a dusty old ledger, a secret that was about to turn this tale of heartbreak into the most epic story of revenge you have ever heard. Olivia Bennet believed in the architecture of a perfect life. She and her husband, Nicholas Valmont, had built theirs in a sprawling penthouse overlooking Central Park, a palace of glass and steel where the city lights glittered below like a carpet of fallen stars. Their life was a carefully curated collection of successes. Nick, the charismatic CEO of Ethelred Tech, a company he'd inherited and rebranded into a modern powerhouse. And Olivia, the brilliant but unassuming art historian, whose quiet support was the invisible scaffolding holding up his world. To their friends, they were the golden couple. Nick, with his sharp suits, confident smile, and a laugh that could fill any room, was the engine. Olivia, with her serene grace, gentle wit, and an uncanny ability to remember the names of everyone's children, was the heart. She organized the flawless dinner parties, charmed the stodgy board members' wives, and edited his late-night speeches until they shone. She was, in his own frequent words, his better half, his rock. But lately the rock had begun to feel the strain of erosion. The late nights at the office became more frequent, explained away by a difficult merger or a demanding new project. The scent of an unfamiliar, cloyingly sweet perfume clung to his suit jackets, which he'd blame on a huggy European investor. His phone, once left carelessly on the nightstand, was now perpetually face down or in his pocket, guarded like a state secret. Olivia, 3 months pregnant, and still guarding the secret with a quiet, joyful anticipation, chose to believe him. It was easier. The alternative was a crack in the foundation of their perfect life, a crack she wasn't ready to face. She attributed his distance to the immense pressure he was under. Ethelred Tech was his family's legacy, and his father's shadow loomed large. She told herself that once this big merger was finalized, he would be hers again. This evening was supposed to be a return to form. The annual Starlight Foundation Gala at the Metropolitan Club on Fifth Avenue was the crown jewel of the New York social calendar. It was an event where fortunes were pledged and reputations were cemented. For Olivia, it was something more. It was the night she would finally tell Nick about the baby. She had imagined the moment 1,000 times. They'd be on the terrace, the cool night air around them, the city's hum a distant melody. She would take his hand, place it on her still flat stomach, and watch his eyes light up, chasing away the shadows that had gathered there for months. wear the navy blue gown Nick had said that morning, barely looking up from his tablet. The one from the fundraiser in Milan. It makes you look statuesque. She smiled a small, genuine smile. I was thinking the emerald silk. It's new. He finally looked at her, his gaze sweeping over her in a way that felt more like an appraisal than a loving glance. No, the navy. It's classic. We need to project stability tonight. Peterson from the board will be there with his wife. He said it with a finality that brooked no argument. So the navy gown it was. As she stood before the full-length mirror, the deep blue fabric shimmering under the recessed lighting, she felt a pang of unease. The dress felt like a uniform for the role of Mrs. Valmont, a role she had played with devotion. She ran a hand over her abdomen. Soon there would be a new role, mother. The thought gave her a surge of strength. Tonight everything would change for the better. Nick walked into the dressing room already in his tuxedo. He looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine, devastatingly handsome and radiating an almost aggressive confidence. He adjusted his cufflinks, his eyes on his own reflection. "You look perfect, Liv," he said, the compliment feeling rehearsed. He walked over and kissed her cheek, a dry, passionless gesture. "The car is waiting. Let's not be late. I need to have a word with Gerald Feinstein before the auction starts." As they rode the silent elevator down to the lobby, Olivia rehearsed the words in her mind. "Nick, I have something wonderful to tell you. We're going to be a family." Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird beating against the bars of a gilded cage. She was so lost in her hopeful daydream that she didn't notice the way Nick was checking his watch, a flicker of something, not excitement, but a cold, sharp anxiety in his eyes. The perfect life was still standing, but the tremors were getting stronger, and Olivia was about to find out she was standing directly on the fault line. The Metropolitan Club was a bastion of old New York, a place where fortunes were generations deep, and the air was thick with the scent of money power and expensive perfume. Chandeliers dripped crystals like frozen tears from the impossibly high ceilings, and the murmur of the city's elite filled the grand ballroom. Olivia felt a familiar sense of calm settle over her as they entered. This was her world, or at least the one she had adopted. She smiled and nodded at familiar faces, the perfect hostess even on her husband's arm. "There's Gerald," Nick said, his grip on her elbow tightening. "Go say hello to Judith Peterson. Keep her occupied. You know how she loves to talk about her garden." He gave her a dismissive pat on the arm and strode off into the crowd before she could reply. Left alone, Olivia took a deep breath. She made her way through the sea of tuxedos and designer gowns, exchanging pleasantries with an easy grace. She found Judith Peterson by the silent auction tables and listened patiently to a 20-minute monologue about the challenges of growing heirloom tomatoes in a rooftop garden. Through it all, her eyes scanned the room for Nick waiting for the right moment. An hour later, the auction was about to begin, and guests were being ushered to their tables. Olivia found theirs table 1 front and center, but Nick was still absent. A few of their friends, a couple named Robert and Patricia Langley, were already seated. "Olivia, you look divine," Patricia said, air-kissing both of her cheeks. "Where's the man of the hour? Closing a deal?" I'm sure Robert chuckled, raising his glass. Nick never stops. Olivia's polite smile was beginning to feel brittle. Her gaze swept the grand entrance one more time, and that's when she saw him. He was standing under the magnificent archway, bathed in the warm glow of the sconces. He was laughing that big room-filling laugh of his. But he wasn't alone. On his arm was a woman Olivia had never seen before. She was younger, with sleek, raven-black hair, cut in a severe bob, and a predatory confidence that seemed to radiate from her. She was wearing a crimson dress, a slash of defiant colour in a room of elegant navies and blacks. The dress was daringly low-cut, clinging to her like a second skin. It was the kind of dress designed not just to be seen, but to make a statement. For a moment, Olivia's mind refused to process the image. It had to be a business associate, a client. There were 100 logical explanations. But then, Nick leaned down and whispered something in the woman's ear, his lips brushing her skin. The woman tilted her head back and laughed a sound that was sharp and triumphant. She placed her hand on his chest, right over his heart, and left it there. It was a gesture of such casual, profound intimacy that the air left Olivia's lungs in a sudden, painful rush. The room began to tilt. The murmur of the crowd faded into a dull roar in her ears. People were starting to notice. Heads were turning, whispers spreading through the room like a virus. They were all looking at Nick and the woman in red, and then their eyes, filled with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity, were flicking to her. To the wife. At table 1, Nick, seemingly oblivious or worse, completely indifferent to the unfolding social carnage, began to lead the woman into the ballroom, not towards a discreet corner table, but directly towards his own. Directly towards Olivia. Robert Langley's jaw was slack. Patricia's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. They watched frozen as Nicholas Valmont, CEO of Ethelred Tech, paraded his mistress in front of his friends, his colleagues, his entire world, and brought her straight to the table where his pregnant wife was sitting. He stopped before her, his smile unwavering, though it didn't reach his eyes. Those were cold appraising. "Olivia," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "I'd like you to meet Bianca Reed. She's the new head of our strategic development department, an absolute rock star. Bianca, this is my wife, Olivia." Bianca Reed's eyes, a cool, calculating shade of grey, raked over Olivia. There was no apology in them, no shame. Only a clear, undisguised victory. She extended a hand with blood-red nails. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you," she purred, her voice dripping with insincerity. "Nick has told me so much about you." Olivia couldn't breathe. Her own hand remained in her lap, trembling. The champagne glass on the table in front of her seemed to mock her. The perfect night, the wonderful news. It all dissolved into this single, brutal, public humiliation. Her secret, the joyful news of their child, felt like a lead weight in her stomach, a vulnerability she was suddenly desperate to hide. She looked at Nick, her eyes pleading, searching for some explanation, a sign that this was a monstrous misunderstanding. But she found nothing, only a chilling detachment. It was then she understood. This wasn't a mistake. This was a message. He wasn't just leaving her. He was erasing her. He was showing everyone that she was disposable, and this new, sharp, ambitious woman was her replacement. Slowly, deliberately, Olivia rose to her feet. The entire table, and it seemed the entire ballroom, held its breath. For a heartbeat, a wild, primal scream built in her chest. She wanted to rage, to throw the champagne in his smug face, to expose him for the monster he was. But then she felt a faint, deep flutter within her. A tiny, insistent reminder of the life she was protecting. And in that moment, something shifted. The heartbreak, sharp and blinding, didn't vanish, but it was joined by a current of ice-cold clarity. She would not give him the satisfaction of a scene. She would not be the hysterical, scorned wife. She looked not at Bianca, but directly into her husband's eyes. She held his gaze until he was the one who looked away first. Then, without a single word, she turned. With a dignity she didn't know she possessed, her back straight. Her head held high. Olivia. Bennett Valmont walked out of the ballroom, away from the whispers. the pitying stares and the ruins of her perfect life, leaving the man who was the father of her unborn child standing beside his mistress in the wreckage. The taxi ride back to the penthouse was a blur of smeared city lights and a suffocating silence. Olivia walked through the opulent apartment that had once been her home and now felt like a stranger's museum. Every object, the photos on the mantelpiece, the books she'd lovingly arranged, the art she had chosen, was a monument to a lie. She didn't cry. The pain was too deep for tears. It was a cold, hollow thing that had settled in her bones. She packed a single bag with numb efficiency, a few changes of clothes, a toothbrush, her laptop. She paused by the small antique writing desk in the corner of their bedroom. Inside, beneath a stack of stationery, was a small velvet box. She opened it. It was the positive pregnancy test and the first ultrasound picture, a grainy black and white image of a tiny flickering promise. She had been going to gift it to Nick tonight. She snapped the box shut and put it in her purse. This secret was hers alone now. She didn't go to her parents in Connecticut. She couldn't bear their well-meaning sympathy, the questions she couldn't answer. Instead, she took a car service 2 hours north, deep into the Hudson Valley, to the one place she knew she would be safe, her grandfather's house. Her grandfather, Arthur Bennett, had passed away 2 years prior. He was a quiet, unassuming man, a retired history professor who had preferred dusty books to stock portfolios. His house was a reflection of him, a rambling old stone house set on 50 acres of overgrown woods, filled with the scent of old paper lemon polish and pipe tobacco. It was a place of solitude and memory. For the first week, Olivia did nothing. She slept in her grandfather's guest room, the silence of the house a stark contrast to the roar in her head. She walked the wooded paths, the crunch of leaves under her feet, the only sound. She let the grief wash over her in waves, allowing herself to feel the full, crushing weight of Nick's betrayal. The humiliation of that night played on a loop in her mind, each detail a fresh stab of pain. She was adrift, a ghost in her own life. On the 8th day, a storm rolled in, trapping her inside. Restless and raw, she found herself drawn to her grandfather's study. It was a room he had rarely let anyone into, his private sanctuary. It was just as he had left it. Books on military history and economic theory were stacked from floor to ceiling. On his large oak desk sat an old leather-bound ledger, a relic from another era. Idly she opened it. The pages were filled with her grandfather's neat, precise handwriting. At first she thought they were historical notes, but then she saw the names General Electric, IBM, Procter & Gamble, and dates and numbers, lots of them. Buy orders, sell orders, dividend reinvestment plans. It wasn't a history book. It was a meticulously kept record of a stock portfolio stretching back 50 years. Curiosity piqued, she started digging deeper into his desk. In a locked bottom drawer, for which she found the key in a small carved wooden box, she found a series of newer, professionally bound portfolio statements, and a letter addressed to her in his familiar script. Her hands trembled as she opened it. "My dearest Olivia, if you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you have found yourself in need of this room. I always hoped you never would. You see the world through the lens of art and beauty, a gift I have always admired. I, on the other hand, have always seen it through the lens of numbers and systems. It is a duller view, perhaps, but a useful one. The man you knew as a quiet history professor was only part of the story. In my youth I made a few fortunate investments. I learned that true power isn't loud, it's silent. It doesn't sit on a throne, it owns the throne. Over the decades I cultivated this power not for myself, but as a safeguard. For our family. For you. This portfolio is now yours. It is managed by a trust, the Bennett Trust. It is substantial, more than you can imagine. But there is one investment I must draw your attention to. It was a risk of favor to an old friend, a man named George Valmont. Olivia's breath hitched. George Valmont. Nick's father. George was a brilliant engineer but a terrible businessman. When he founded his little tech company, I backed him. Silently, through a series of holding companies. Over the years, as his Ethelred tech grew, my stake grew with it. When he passed his son, Nicholas inherited the CEO title and his father's shares, but he never knew the identity of the company's largest silent partner. He never knew that a quiet history professor in the Hudson Valley held the controlling interest. Olivia had to sit down. The room spun. She looked at the most recent statement from the Bennett Trust. The numbers were staggering, a constellation of assets that ran into the billions. And there it was at the very top of the list, the largest single holding Ethelred Technologies Inc., 51% ownership. She was the majority shareholder. She owned the company. The letter continued. I had my reservations about Nicholas. He has his father's ambition, but lacks his integrity. I hoped your goodness would temper his arrogance. Perhaps it has. But if it has not, and if he has ever made you feel small, I am giving you this, my dear girl. It is not just money. It is a shield, a sword, and a fortress. Use it wisely. Contact my lawyer, a man named Samuel Davies, of Davies and Finch in the city. He knows everything. He is utterly discreet and fiercely loyal. He has been waiting for your call. Be strong, Olivia. You are a Bennett. We are not the type to be erased. Olivia dropped the letter, her body shaking, not with grief, but with something new. A powerful, terrifying, electrifying surge of adrenaline. The hollow space inside her began to fill with a white-hot fire. Nick had tried to humiliate her, to cast her aside like a broken object. He paraded his mistress, believing he held all the cards, that she was nothing without him. He had built his kingdom on her grandfather's money. He had used her family's legacy to fund the very life with which he had betrayed her. The ghost of the quiet history professor had just handed his granddaughter an arsenal. The tears that finally came were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of rage, of focus, and of a dawning, terrible resolve. The game wasn't over. It had just begun. While Olivia was discovering her inheritance, Nicholas Valmont was thriving. In his mind, the gala had been a resounding success. He had excised the weak link Olivia with surgical precision and simultaneously introduced his vibrant, ruthless new partner, Bianca Reed. The whispers that followed were not to him a source of shame, but a confirmation of his power. Only a man at the absolute top of his game could afford to be so bold. He had sent Olivia a single curt text message the morning after the gala. My lawyers will be in touch about the arrangements. I trust you'll be civil. He received no reply. Her silence, he concluded, was an admission of defeat. He pictured her crying at her parents' home in Connecticut, a tragic, weak figure he could now safely pity from a distance. The thought that she might be capable of anything other than heartbreak never once crossed his mind. His entire focus was on his magnum opus, the acquisition of a rival tech firm, Cybercore Dynamics. It was a massive, highly leveraged deal, one that the more conservative members of the Ethelred board, particularly the old guard loyal to his father's memory, had balked at. They saw it as a reckless gamble. Nick saw it as his coronation, the move that would finally eclipse his father's legacy and make him a legend in the industry. Bianca was his chief architect in this campaign. Her official title was Head of Strategic Development, but her real role was Nick's enforcer and ego stroker. She was brilliant moral and completely devoted to the acquisition, largely because the commission and stock options tied to it would make her phenomenally wealthy. "Peterson is still waffling," Bianca said, pacing Nick's expansive office. She was a bolt of energy, a stark contrast to Olivia's serene presence. "He keeps talking about fiduciary duty and shareholder value. The old dinosaur doesn't have the stomach for a fight." Nick leaned back in his leather chair, a portrait of unbothered confidence. "Don't worry about Andrew Peterson. He's a relic. His loyalty was to my father, not the company's future. Once the deal is done, he and the rest of his cronies will be singing my praises. We need his vote to be secure. Nick." She pressed her tone sharp. "And Ms. Chen is on the fence. She's worried about the debt load we'll be taking on. I'll handle Chen." He waved a dismissive hand. "I'll take her to dinner, at per se charm her a little. It always works." He paused, a smirk playing on his lips. "It's a shame Olivia isn't here. She was always so good at smoothing things over with the board wives. A quaint but useful skill." The casual cruelty of the remark hung in the air. To Nick, Olivia had been a tool, a useful appliance for managing the softer, more tedious aspects of his life. Now that she was gone, he barely registered her absence beyond these minor inconveniences. What he failed to grasp was the deep-seated structure of his own company. He saw himself as an absolute monarch, but Ethelred Tech was a public corporation with a board of directors and, most importantly, shareholders. While he held his father's significant block of shares, it was less than a controlling interest. He had always relied on the tacit support of a large anonymous block of shares, held in a truster block that had always voted with management, with his father, and subsequently with him. He assumed this support was a permanent feature of the landscape, as reliable as the sunrise. He never once bothered to investigate the identity of the Bennett Trust, dismissing it as some dusty institutional fund. His plan was simple: call an emergency board meeting, use a combination of charisma and brute force to push the Cybercore acquisition vote through, and then celebrate his victory. He instructed his assistant to schedule the meeting for the following Wednesday. "This is it, B," he said, pulling Bianca onto his lap. "In 1 week we'll be running the biggest tech firm on the East Coast, and you'll be right by my side." And Olivia Bianca asked, her voice a low purr as she traced the line of his jaw. "Olivia will receive a very generous settlement and fade into obscurity," he said with absolute certainty. "She'll probably remarry some boring professor and spend her days talking about pottery. It's what she's built for." The day before the board meeting, Nick received a registered letter from a law firm he didn't recognize, Davies and Finch. He opened it with mild curiosity, assuming it was from Olivia's new divorce attorney. The letter was brief and formal. It was a legal notification. "Dear Mr. Valmont, please be advised that pursuant to Article 3, Section 4 of the Ethelred Technologies, Inc., corporate bylaws, our client, the primary representative of the Bennett Trust, will be attending the emergency board meeting scheduled for Wednesday, September 17th. The representative will be exercising the Trust's full voting rights in all matters brought before the board. Sincerely, Samuel Davies, senior partner." Nick read it twice. The Bennett Trust. Why, after decades of silent proxy voting, would they suddenly send a representative in person? It was an anomaly, an irritating wrinkle in his perfect plan. "Who the hell are these people?" he muttered, tossing the letter onto his desk. "What is it?" Bianca asked. "The big silent partner, the Bennett Trust, is sending a rep to the meeting tomorrow." First time in history. He shrugged his arrogance, a thick shield against any real concern. Probably some stuffy old banker who wants to feel important. "It doesn't matter. They've always voted with us. It's a formality." He picked up the phone and buzzed his assistant. "Jessica, one more for the board meeting tomorrow. A representative from the Bennett Trust." "No, I don't have a name. Just put a placeholder on the seating chart and order the good coffee. We'll want to be in a celebratory mood." He hung up his mind, already moving on to the victory speech he would give. The king, secure in his castle, never once thought to check who was standing at the gates, holding the deed to the entire kingdom. He was about to learn that relics, old loyalties, and quiet, unassuming wives could be more dangerous than he ever imagined. In the serene quiet of her grandfather's study, Olivia Bennet was undergoing a profound transformation. The heartbroken wife was being systematically replaced by a calculating and formidable strategist. The room, once a place of refuge and grief, had become her war room. Her days were a rigorous, self-imposed boot camp in corporate governance. She didn't just read the files her grandfather had left, she devoured them. Balance sheets, profit and loss statements, market analyses, shareholder reports from the last 20 years. What had once seemed like an impenetrable language of numbers began to resolve into a clear picture of the company Nick was so carelessly gambling with. Her guide in this new world was Samuel Davies. He was a man in his late 60s, with kind eyes, a razor-sharp mind, and an almost fanatical loyalty to her grandfather's memory. He flew up to the Hudson Valley the day after she called, bringing with him boxes of documents and a lifetime of wisdom. "Your grandfather wasn't just an investor, Olivia," he explained, his voice gentle but firm as they sat by the fireplace. "He was a builder. He believed in creating value, not just chasing profits. He saw Ethelred as a testament to innovation, a legacy for his friend George. He would be displeased by its current trajectory." Davies laid out Nick's proposed acquisition of Cybercore. He didn't use emotional language. He used numbers. He showed her the mountain of debt the company would have to take on. He pointed out the redundancies in their tech, the culture clash that would inevitably follow, and the obscene personal payout Nick and his executive team would receive if the deal went through regardless of its long-term success. "It's not a merger," Davies concluded, his expression grim. "It's a raid. Nicholas is gutting the company his father built to service his own ego." A cold fury settled in Olivia's heart. This wasn't just about her humiliation anymore. It was about legacy, her grandfather's Nick's father's, and now the one she would build for her child. She also made another call to a number Davies had given her, the number of Andrew Peterson, the dinosaur on the board Nick so casually dismissed. Peterson had been Ethelred's chief financial officer for 30 years under George Valmont, and had stayed on the board out of loyalty to his old friend. "Mr. Peterson," she said, her voice steady. "My name is Olivia Bennet. Arthur Bennet was my grandfather." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, then a voice thick with emotion. "I knew it. I always wondered. Arthur was a great man, the finest man I ever knew. My God, his granddaughter." Olivia spent an hour on the phone with Peterson. He confirmed everything Davies had suspected. Nick was bullying the board, misrepresenting data, and rushing the vote before anyone could conduct proper due diligence. "He's arrogant, Mrs. Valmont," Olivia Peterson said, his voice heavy. "He thinks we're all fools. He has this young woman, this Bianca Reed, feeding him exactly what he wants to hear. There's something about her. I don't trust her. She's too slick." That was when Olivia asked the question that would change everything. "Mr. Peterson, can you look into her discreetly? Her work history, her connections. Anything." "Consider it done," he replied without hesitation. For the next few days, Olivia and Davies worked relentlessly. They built their counter-argument, a precise, data-driven dismantling of the Cybercore deal. They prepared motions, drafted new resolutions, and mapped out the procedural intricacies of a corporate board meeting. Olivia, the art historian who once curated exhibits, was now curating a boardroom coup. She was no longer hiding. She was preparing. The pain of Nick's betrayal hadn't vanished, but she had learned to channel it. It was no longer a debilitating grief. It was fuel. Every time she felt a pang of sadness, she would look at the ultrasound picture she kept on the desk. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for the future, for a legacy of integrity her child could be proud of. The evening before the meeting, Andrew Peterson called. His voice was tight with urgency. "Olivia, you were right to be suspicious. It's worse than we thought. Bianca Reed didn't just come from our competitor Omnicorp. It seems she never really left." "What do you mean?" Olivia asked, her pen pausing over a spreadsheet. "I hired a private investigator, a former FBI guy. He found encrypted emails, financial records. She's been feeding Ethelred's proprietary R&D data to Omnicorp for the last 6 months, specifically our new AI-driven logistics patent. It's the crown jewel of the company. The Cybercore deal, it's a smoke screen. The debt would cripple Ethelred, making it vulnerable. Omnicorp would then swoop in, buy us for pennies on the dollar, and get our patent for a fraction of its worth. Bianca was promised a senior vice president position and a 7-figure signing bonus." Olivia felt a chill go down her spine. Nick wasn't just being betrayed by his mistress. He was the pawn in her much larger, more devastating game. His arrogance and ego had made him the perfect tool for a rival company to use to destroy his own. "Do you have proof?" Olivia asked, her voice dangerously calm. "Irrefutable," Peterson confirmed. "Digital forensic reports, bank transfers. It's all here." Olivia looked at Samuel Davies, who had been listening on speakerphone. His expression was grim but resolute. This changed the stakes entirely. "Thank you, Andrew," Olivia said. "Bring everything you have tomorrow. Don't say a word to anyone." After she hung up, she walked to the window and looked out at the dark woods. The storm had passed, and the night was clear and cold. For the first time in weeks, her mind was completely still. She knew exactly what she had to do. She wasn't just going to stop a bad deal, she was going to clean house. She placed a hand on her stomach. The quiet general was ready for battle, and she was going to take no prisoners. The Ethelred Technologies boardroom was on the 50th floor, a sleek, sterile space designed to convey power. A long, polished mahogany table reflected the grey morning sky. At the head of it sat Nicholas Valmont, looking every bit the triumphant king. He was laughing with a board member to his right, radiating a confidence that bordered on smugness. Bianca Reed was not on the board, but she was present, seated in a chair just behind Nick's like a consigliere. She wore a sharp, tailored white suit, a stark contrast to her scandalous red dress from the gala, but projecting the same aura of untouchable ambition. She reviewed her notes on a tablet, a small, knowing smile on her lips. They were a team, a power couple, and this meeting was to be their coronation. The other board members filed in a collection of stern-faced men and women in expensive suits. There was Miss Chen, her brow furrowed with concern, and Andrew Peterson, who looked unusually grim, his jaw set. Nick greeted them with practiced charm, undeterred by their somber mood. He knew he had the votes. It would be tight, but it would pass. "Good morning, everyone." Nick began, his voice booming with authority. "Let's get started. We have an exciting and transformative opportunity to discuss today. The Cybercore acquisition will position Ethelred as the undisputed leader in our sector for decades too." He was cut short by the sound of the boardroom doors opening. Every head turned. Standing in the doorway was a woman they all recognized, but a version of her they had never seen before. It was Olivia. But this was not the gentle, smiling Olivia who hosted their charity dinners. This woman was poised and formidable. She wore a simple but impeccably tailored grey dress that conveyed authority, not victimhood. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek, severe style. Her face was pale and composed, but her eyes, which had always been warm and soft, were now like chips of ice. They held a clarity and a power that was utterly arresting. Flanking her was an older, distinguished gentleman with a leather briefcase, Samuel Davies. A shocked silence fell over the room. The board members stared, their mouths agape. Bianca Reed's smile vanished, replaced by a flicker of confusion and alarm. Nick was the most stunned of all. He shot to his feet, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "Olivia, what in God's name are you doing here? This is a closed board meeting." Security. Olivia didn't flinch. She met his enraged gaze with a look of utter calm. "I believe I have a right to be here, Nicholas. You have no rights here," he spat, his voice rising. "This is my company, my boardroom." Samuel Davies stepped forward, placing his briefcase on the mahogany table with a quiet, definitive thud. "On the contrary, Mr. Valmont," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "My client, Mrs. Valmont, is not here as your wife." He opened the briefcase and began to methodically place a series of documents in front of Nick's seat. Each one landed with a soft, damning slap. "She is here in her capacity as the sole trustee and representative of the Bennett Trust." The name hung in the air, an unexploded bomb. Andrew Peterson looked down at his notes, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Ms. Chen's eyes widened in dawning comprehension. Nick stared at the documents, then back at Olivia, his mind refusing to connect the dots. The Bennett Trust. That's impossible. That's some investment fund. The Bennett Trust. Olivia said, her voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the silent room, was founded by my grandfather, Arthur Bennett. It is and has been, since this company's inception, the majority shareholder of Ethelred Technologies. She walked slowly, deliberately towards the table. The other board members seemed to shrink back in their chairs, making way for her. She was no longer just Nick's wife. She was the room's center of gravity, the undisputed locus of power. "You've been voting with my grandfather's proxies for your entire career, Nicholas. You just never bothered to ask who you were thanking." She stopped, not at the end of the table, but at a chair directly opposite him, taking her seat with a quiet grace that was more intimidating than any shout. Davies sat beside her, her silent, formidable counsel. The color drained from Nick's face. The swagger, the arrogance, the unshakable confidence, it all evaporated in an instant, leaving behind a hollow, panicked shell. He looked from Olivia's cold, determined face to Bianca's, which was now a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He had walked into this room, a king ready to claim his new kingdom, but he had forgotten about the queen. And she had just walked back into the castle and announced that she owned the throne, the bricks, and the land for miles around. The meeting he had called to cement his legacy was about to become his execution. For a full minute, the only sound in the boardroom was the frantic, panicked rhythm of Nicholas Valmont's breathing. He stared at Olivia, his mind reeling. The supportive wife, the art historian, the woman he had dismissed as a decorative accessory to his life, was now seated across from him, holding the fate of his entire world in her hands. "This is a joke," he finally managed, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Some kind of vindictive trick." "I assure you, Mr. Valmont, the SEC filings are no joke," Samuel Davies said, dryly gesturing to the documents before him. "The Bennett Trust holds 51% of all voting shares. My client controls this company, and therefore she controls this meeting. Olivia let the weight of that statement settle. She looked around the table, her gaze pausing on each board member before finally landing back on her husband. "Before we proceed," she said, her voice a model of icy composure, "I'd like to make a motion. I move to reject the proposed acquisition of Cybercore Dynamics, effective immediately." Andrew Peterson seconded the motion before the words were fully out of her mouth. "I second." "You can't do that," Nick exploded, slamming his fist on the table. "We have a deal. This is the future of the company." "Is it?" Nicholas Olivia countered, her voice dangerously soft. She slid a financial summary across the table, one prepared by Davies. "Is a future of crippling debt, mass layoffs of loyal Ethelred employees, and a $30 million synergy bonus paid directly to you and your executive team really what's best for this company? Or is it just what's best for you?" Ms. Chen picked up the summary, her eyes scanning the damning figures. She looked from the paper to Nick, her expression hardening. The charm had worn off. All she saw now was the greed. "I call for a vote," Olivia stated. "All in favor of rejecting the Cybercore acquisition." Her own hand went up. Samuel Davies raised his beside hers, representing her proxy. Andrew Peterson's hand shot up. After a moment's hesitation, Ms. Chen raised hers, followed by two other board members, who had clearly been swayed by the new reality. It was a landslide. Nick watched aghast as his magnum opus, his legacy-defining deal, was dismantled in less than 5 minutes. He was utterly powerless. "The motion carries," Olivia announced into the stunned silence. "The Cybercore deal is dead." She then turned her gaze to the woman in the white suit who had been watching the proceedings with a growing sense of dread. "Now for our second item of business," Olivia continued, her tone becoming even colder. "Corporate espionage." Bianca Reed went rigid. "Mr. Peterson," Olivia prompted, "if you would." Andrew Peterson, no longer a waffling dinosaur but an avenging angel of the old guard, stood up. "Over the past several days, at the request of the majority shareholder, I initiated an internal investigation into a potential security breach. The investigation uncovered a systematic, ongoing effort to leak proprietary research and development data, specifically the source code and schematics for our patented Helios Logistics AI, to a direct competitor, Omnicorp." He placed a thick file on the table and opened it. "We have recovered encrypted emails, tracked illicit financial transfers, and have a full forensic analysis of the network activity. The source of the leak has been identified." He paused for dramatic effect, looking directly at Bianca. The data was being transferred from the workstation and personal devices of Ms. Bianca Reed. A collective gasp went through the room. Bianca shot to her feet, her face ashen. "That's a lie. It's absurd. This is a fabrication." Nick stared at her, a dawning horror on his face. He remembered her late nights, her obsession with the Helios project, her private calls. He had seen it as ambition. Now he saw it as treason. The woman he had cast his wife aside for hadn't been his partner. She had been his saboteur. "Is it, Olivia?" said her voice, cutting through Bianca's denials. She nodded at Davies, who tapped a key on his laptop. A screen on the boardroom wall flickered to life, displaying a single damning email from Bianca to a senior executive at Omnicorp. Its subject line was "Helios Final Schematics, Wire Transfer Confirmation." The room fell into a deathly hush. Bianca sank back into her chair, utterly exposed. "Security, Olivia," said her voice, ringing with command. Two guards who had been waiting discreetly outside the doors entered the room. "Please escort Ms. Reed from the premises. Her access is to be revoked immediately. Our legal team will be in contact with her and with the district attorney's office." As the guards took a non-protesting, completely broken Bianca by the arms and led her out, Olivia's eyes met Nick's across the table. In his gaze, she saw the complete and utter collapse of a man. He had lost his deal, his mistress, and his reputation in the span of 15 minutes. All that was left was the company he had tried to break, now owned by the wife he had tried to destroy. And finally, Olivia said, her voice softening almost imperceptibly, "We need to discuss the future leadership of Ethelred Technologies. I believe it's clear that a change is needed. A change that prioritizes integrity, loyalty, and a vision that honors the legacy of George Valmont rather than plundering it." She looked at her husband, the man who had humiliated her, underestimated her, and betrayed her in every conceivable way. She held all the power. She could have fired him on the spot, dragged his name through the mud, and annihilated what little he had left. But revenge, she was learning, was not about destruction. It was about building something better from the ashes. "I am calling for a vote of no confidence in CEO Nicholas Valmont," she announced. "And I am proposing an interim CEO, effective immediately to guide us through this transition, Mr. Andrew Peterson." Nick didn't even wait for the vote. He knew it was over. Pushing his chair back with a scraping sound that echoed his own grating defeat, he stood up. He didn't look at anyone. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the boardroom, a king leaving his own execution, stripped of his crown, his power, and his pride. The doors swung shut behind him, leaving Olivia Bennett, the true shareholder, in complete control. In the weeks that followed, the boardroom reckoning, the story became the stuff of New York legend. Whispers at cocktail parties and bold headlines in financial journals told a tale of high-stakes drama, the fall of the arrogant CEO, the corporate spy in a designer suit, and the emergence of the quiet, mysterious wife who turned out to be the most powerful person in the room. Nicholas Valmont vanished from public life. He was forced to resign in disgrace, his name toxic in the circles he once dominated. Stripped of his CEO title and salary, facing a lawsuit from the company for gross negligence, and publicly shamed, he retreated to a life of obscurity. The divorce was swift and silent. He took a small settlement, a pittance, compared to what he once had, and Olivia never saw him again. Bianca Reed fared worse, facing federal charges for corporate espionage. But Olivia had no time to gloat. She had a company to rebuild. Working alongside the newly appointed CEO Andrew Peterson, she plunged herself into the heart of Ethelred Technologies. She wasn't a figurehead shareholder. She was an active driving force. She walked the floors of the R&D labs, talking to the engineers her grandfather had so admired. She met with department heads, listening to their ideas and concerns. She dismantled the toxic, ego-driven culture Nick had fostered and began to replace it with one based on collaboration, innovation, and integrity. Her first major act as the controlling shareholder was to kill all plans for layoffs. Instead, she announced a new initiative, the George Valmont Innovation Fund, a multi-million-dollar internal program to fund promising employee projects, the very kind of forward-thinking investment Nick had always cut in favor of flashier short-term gains. The move sent a shockwave of renewed loyalty and morale through the company. She sold the cold minimalist penthouse overlooking the park and made her grandfather's house in the Hudson Valley her permanent home, commuting to the city when needed. The house was no longer a place of grief, but a sanctuary of strength and legacy. She turned her grandfather's study into her own, the old leather ledger, sitting on the desk as a constant reminder of the quiet power of wisdom and patience. As her pregnancy progressed, her presence at the company became a powerful symbol. Here was a woman not choosing between family and career, but seamlessly integrating them. She was building a future on two fronts, a healthy, ethical company and a safe, loving home for her child. She wasn't just fixing the house Nick broke. She was building an entirely new foundation, one that was strong, true, and entirely her own. One crisp autumn afternoon, she stood in her office, the one that had once been Nick's, looking out at the panoramic view of the city. Andrew Peterson entered, holding a new product prototype. "The engineering team is calling it the Bennett lens," he said with a warm smile. A new way of seeing things. They thought it was fitting. Olivia smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. She placed a hand on her prominent baby bump, feeling the strong, steady kick of the new life within her. She had endured the deepest public humiliation, the most painful personal betrayal. She had walked through the fire and had not been consumed. Instead, she had been forged into something stronger, something unbreakable. She was no longer Mrs. Nicholas Valmont, the perfect wife in a gilded cage. She was Olivia Bennett, the woman who had turned her inheritance into a declaration of independence. Looking out at the endless expanse of the city, she felt a profound sense of peace. The past was a scar, but the future was a blueprint, and for the first time, she was the sole architect. And she was just getting started. And so Olivia's story isn't just about the fall of a cheating husband, but the rise of a queen who discovered her own power when she had nothing left to lose. It's a powerful reminder that the quietest people in the room are often the ones holding all the cards, and that the deepest betrayals can sometimes lead to our greatest triumphs. True strength isn't about the life you are given, but about the one you have the courage to build from the rubble. She didn't just reclaim her life, she rebuilt an entire legacy for herself and her child. If Olivia's incredible journey from heartbreak to the boardroom moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder of their own inner strength. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable real-life stories of justice and empowerment. What did you think of Nick's ultimate downfall? Let us know in the comments below,